and we're here to talk to Blair Wilson and Beth Wilson about their practice, and interviewing you are Deborah van der Plaat and myself, Janina Gosseye.
You want me to start?
Yeah, whatever you.
Beth, I thought we might start when you received your qualification in landscape architecture. I believe you received a graduate diploma in landscape architecture in 1971 from QIT.
Correct.
Is that correct? I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about the course. When did you enrol, and what was the nature of the course at QIT at that time?
Right, so I must have enrolled in the course, I think it started, this was in a normal course.
Mm-hmm.
It was developed by a couple of architects who'd gone to England and picked up some landscape degrees and come back and instigated the course at the QIT. The person who was in charge and who was a leading figure in that was a fellow called Malcolm Bunsley.
Mm-hmm.
He was later joined by George Williams, and both of them were in the same category in that they were architects primarily. And so when the first course started, there was the opportunity to join the course, and I think there might have been 18 of us. This was the very first course. Maybe 17. 14 of them were architects, practicing architects.
Mm-hmm.
And 3, which was me. I had a science degree with a botany major. What was the other one? He became a nurseryman. He was a nurseryman. I'll think of his name. Hanger. Not John Hanger. I'll think of it later. David Hanger.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a course that they had a lot of teething. Well, it didn't have teething problems, but it was stitched together more or less from people who had been involved in somewhat in the landscape business, but not totally committed to it, simply because those people didn't exist at the time. So the predominant feature was on with the architects. There was input from horticulturists. There was input from Carl Langer, and I'm not quite sure what the subject was that he taught, but he was a man who was interested in all the arts, all the visual arts.
Mm-hmm.
Who else was involved? There were civil engineers. A bit of geology, but because I had a science degree, I had an exemption from some of those scientific parts of the course, such as horticulture and geology and etc.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it was part time at night.
Okay.
And it was 3 years.
3 years.
Yes.
Mm. Now, you mentioned you had a science degree. You did that at UQ back in 50.
He graduated 56.
56. Okay. And then
We
you
both
went.
graduated the same night.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's nice.
Yeah, 56. Yeah.
And there's obviously a few years between you taking up the landscape diploma.
Yes.
But why the shift to sort of?
Well, when I finished the science degree, I worked in the department of, as it was called then, agriculture and stock,
Mm-hmm.
in the plant pathology department, and because I had a bacteriology background as well, so it was a very good fit for me because I worked in bacteriology in the plant pathology section. And so then I did the sort of mandatory a year away in England and America, a little bit in Canada, and came back and worked in the Department of Agriculture and Stock. Then got married to Blair, who was an architect, and then when the possibility became available that this course was starting, it just seemed a good fit for me too, to get into landscape because because of the botany component, and that's really why I was allowed into the first landscape course. Similarly, David Hanger, he was also a person who had a botany background.
Mm-hmm.
So, and as I say, all the rest of the architects. So we're quite a bit behind the ball in terms of design and documentation, and really, I guess the 3 years we caught up to an extent, but probably certainly not to the extent that the architects had that competence. And so that's really, it was a bit just serendipity, I guess.
Mm. Did you see it as being sort of an advantage for the practice, or was it just your own personal interest
Well, it was
at that
my
time?
personal interest, and I guess it was also the opportunity because the practice was there.
Mm.
I mean, I guess if the practice wasn't there, it wouldn't have been quite so easy.
Mm-hmm.
So then after I finished the diploma, as it was, I came into the office, but on a very limited time frame, because at that stage we had 4 small children. So, but it gradually sort of built up. And some of the jobs were just private jobs, private people I knew who asked for the work, and some of it came through as part of the office.
Mm-hmm.
And so you studied landscape architecture rather because you married Blair, or was there some influence from your uncle or from the family that was into architecture?
Well, I think that was just incidental, really, or coincidental, I should say. Because as I say, it was it was my mother's brother, so it was a fairly close relation. Bruce Lucas, so he really didn't. I didn't have a great deal of contact with him, really, but just by vicariously, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm. So you didn't have sort of much contact with his work or the type of work he was doing? Or?
Not personally. No. We. I guess.
You're talking about Bruce Lucas?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, he was an academic at that time.
Mm.
Yes, he had become an academic, but
He did significant work pre-war.
yes.
He was professor with Bob Cummings.
Mm.
So yeah, well, I suppose that was. I mean, I don't know how many genes that sort of went in there, but I guess there was some interest from the family point of view.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Langer, who was also at UQ at that time as well. Was QIT the only university offering landscape?
QIT was, I think,
In
I might be, certainly in Queensland.
Mm-hmm.
There may have been a course at RMIT, but I'm not sure.
Okay. So UQ wasn't doing it at that time.
No.
Yeah, even though Langer was.
Yes. Well, he was a very minor part of the course actually.
Mm-hmm.
But he certainly had an interest in landscape. He had an interest in town planning
It was mainly Malcolm Bunsley.
It was Malcolm Bunsley was the leader.
He had gained a landscape degree in England,
Mm-hmm.
built on an architectural degree here.
Mm-hmm. So he's brought it back in a sense
He
with
did.
him.
He
yes.
did. And then he was working with the works department at the time. So I suppose he had. I don't know whether he had the time, but he certainly had the interest to set it up.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess he was approached to set it up, and there certainly was interest within the architectural profession in landscape. As I said, I mean there was 17 to start with, and that probably dwindled down to a lot fewer in the
final year.
Actually the final year everybody was there still.
Okay.
But the next year, I mean, this was the sort of the big intake of architects at that stage.
Mm. And can you remember, you've mentioned a few of your student contemporaries, can you remember who else was in the course?
Well, there was a very good architect called Barbara Vandenbroek, who was, you've heard about Barbara?
Yeah,
She
was
was
in
a-
the list of registered architects in Queensland.
yeah.
Yeah.
She actually was a New Zealander, but she'd married, and she was living here, and she was also a qualified town planner. So she was a very talented person, and she was one of the first. There was Ted Crofts, architect,
Premium Crofts.
Premium Crofts.
Mhm.
There was Lou Haley from Conrad and Gargett. Who else would have been there? Jack Parkinson.
So there were many
Jack in that?
Yeah, Jackin was in that first course.
many people that had studied architecture before were now
Mm.
studying landscape architecture. So
Yeah,
most
but
of
they were old practicing architects.
Yeah.
The age of the architects, the age of the people that went into that first course would have been well into their 40s, coming into 50s.
Mhm.
So
So
it was
established.
It was a very established
Mm.
group of people. There weren't any new practicing architects.
And
involved.
apart from you and Barbara, were there other women as well in the?
Yes, there was another lady called Elena Mottram. I don't know whether you've ever come across her, because I didn't have anything more to do with her after we finished the course. But she was a much older person, but she was an architect, I think, who worked in one of the public areas.
Mhm.
You got Barbara Vandenbroek.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Mm. So you're saying the course was part-time?
Yes,
So
it was
did-
night.
At night, it was a
Yeah,
night course, yeah. So it did lend itself to sort of practicing architects to come in and get an additional
Yeah,
qualification. Mhm. So who were the? I suppose that landscape architecture was starting to emerge at that time as a discipline. Were there any key practitioners the students identified with at that time in terms of landscape architecture or architecture?
In fact, there was one landscape architect practicing in Brisbane, and he was purely a landscape architect.
Mm-hmm.
And his name was Arne Fink, and he's really very significant. His qualifications were from Germany,
Mm-hmm.
and he came to Queensland, and he tried to interest architects in landscape, but at that stage architects were too big and high and mighty to be interested in an outside qualified landscape architect. In fact, from their point of view, they did all the work.
Right.
That was their bag. So there was a bit of competition. Although he did get some work from architects, and he was very instrumental in bringing back, was it like an arts and craft movement?
Mm-hmm.
He got into a lot of the natural materials, including the old railway sleepers that were around at the time, and rocks, and he really began that sort of movement into native plants and the use of natural materials.
Okay.
So, and that was really Arne's influence on the profession, which was quite significant.
Mm.
And was he also involved in the course that was?
No,
taught?
he was qualified when he came here.
But he wasn't teaching or
No,
something.
no,
He was
no,
not
no, no.
involved at all.
No,
And do you
no.
remember some of the projects that he worked on?
Well, I don't think too many of them would be around because because of this use of natural materials and native plants. I mean, they would have vanished, I would think. But he did have influence on other people who sort of took up that same style.
Yeah.
In fact, most people did. It became very much in vogue.
It sort of reminds me a bit of sort of the nuts and berries movement in Sydney at the time. Sort of, they were moving into those sorts of ideas with native vegetation and the adaptation of architecture to its topography and so forth. Was there any sort of awareness of more national movements amongst the students in those?
No, I don't think so.
No, so it was very much
Very
regional.
parochial, yes.
Yeah, okay. All right. It's interesting that you were saying wasn't very well accepted by the local architectural community. And we've sort of got a bit of a sense that was happening also to some extent with Langer. I think, Blair, you spoke a little bit about that at
With what?
with Carl Langer as
Oh,
well,
yes.
sort of the reaction to Carl Langer. I'm just wondering, did you know Carl
Oh, yes.
very
yeah.
well,
Oh, no, couldn't.
just professionally?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Mm.
But, he was a very nice gentlemanly man. In fact, Bruce Lucas was responsible. Bruce Lucas and his wife really helped Carl enormously, because when they first came to Australia, they had no English, and they worked well. Carl did, I think. He worked in some manual jobs before he got himself established here, and people thought that he was just a little bit nutty, because they used to talk about Vienna coffee shops and art and his wife Gertie, as you know. And so therefore, you know, he was just a bit off the track, just a bit left field for most people when he first came, with all his ideas about, you know, people enjoying life sitting in the street, where at the same time, you know, everyone was closing their doors to stop the flies coming in, and he was talking about going out in the streets and drinking coffee.
And was there some sort of, did Fink and Langer knew each other?
I don't really know. There wouldn't be any reason for me to think that they became involved together.
All right, so you joined the practice in 1971, soon after graduating.
Yeah.
You said that was more on a part-time basis?
Well, it was. It was just fitting in mostly with what else I was doing. So I was just looking through here to see if I could.
Yes, what were some of your early projects?
I think that looking through here, it's all very small residentials work.
And that was
although there was I noticed here I did do a lot of work at Gundawindi at one stage there, and again it was with residential gardens out in Western Queensland, which
that's interesting.
Some of them are there. So
Were you involved in Albany Creek?
Albany Creek to a limited degree.
It's the crematorium.
That was Harry Oakman.
That's right, yeah.
And what was the Gundawindi project?
Oh, there was gardens, and you know, I did gardens for one or two, and then everybody got interested in gardens out there. So I did a lot of gardens out there.
In Western Queensland?
Yes.
Well, that would have been interesting in terms of its climate.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting because the sky is the limit for people who live on properties. You know? They can move the world. You know,
there's nothing in the way.
No.
But climatically, I imagine it'd be quite difficult out in.
Well, yes, it was probably learning from them more than anything.
And were these native-based gardens, or?
Yeah, mostly, but mostly people in the Western Queensland tended towards traditional gardens because that was their heritage. And simply because the plants had acclimatised. Where at that time, native plants weren't very much in the market.
No. So it was more traditional gardens around sort of the homestead type thing. And can you think of any particular projects at that time? Any particular names or?
Of projects out there? Well, there was one, some people called Wilson, strangely, but I can't think of the name of the property. I'll find it here. But that was quite a big job where.
That's not the Wilsons in Ascot, that's more Brisbane.
No.
Yeah, because we have a colleague, Andrew Wilson, and he mentioned when we were interviewing Blair that you had done a project for his parents, and that was in Ascot. So.
Andrew.
Well, Andrew's. I'm not sure of his parents' name, but
that's
the Wilson.
Chiller.
Yes, Chiller. That's right.
Oh,
yes,
Chiller,
yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And that you'd done a project for his parents. He remembers that.
Yeah, I had. Yes, I can remember that. Yes, I did. Yes. Yeah.
So he was very taken with that, obviously.
So, but you were getting commissions from all over Queensland?
Well, there was Gundawindi seemed to be. I can't. There were some others, but mostly was centred in the regional work was Gundawindi. Yeah.
And do you know how many people, because you said you studied with about 17, 18 people, did all those people start working as landscape architects, or did they? No.
I think virtually none.
Oh, none.
Well, because they're architects, they
Just went back to
they
their
just had
practice.
another string to their bow.
Mm. Yeah. And just became integrated into their practice. You mentioned Barbara, who was
And
the,
yes.
was the
Oh, to be truthful, no, she did in fact work here as an architect for a little while, but she did practice as a landscape architect. Yes,
Mhm.
she did.
Mm.
Yeah.
Here in Queensland?
And,
Or?
yes, yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Is she
Okay.
still around, Barbara?
No, and she died. She went to Sydney. She had a position at the Ryde Agricultural College,
Okay.
and she died unfortunately because she wasn't that old, but I had lost track of her when she went to Sydney as well.
Mhm. Now you mentioned that most of these were residential projects that you
Yeah.
did, and so there was obviously quite a demand at that time for
Well, yes, I guess so.
interest.
Interest, yes, I
Mm.
guess that's true.
Mm.
Which does seem surprising from everything else I've been telling you. That people weren't in tune to thinking about people who could had any involvement in, and I guess it was sort of termed gardens at the time rather than landscape.
But in relation to the practice, the family practice, were there opportunities for you to incorporate? You've mentioned a crematorium, so you're working to sort of the broader design projects of the practice at that time.
I'm sure there were, but I'm not thinking too much about where they were. But yes, there were sort of little things like, like I just see here a job for Ira Burke, which was some car people, and I know we did some landscape associated with that. So there were lots of little bits, but nothing
Nothing
great.
major
No.
standing out.
No.
We've sort of asked Blair about this already, but how big was the practice at that time in sort of the early 70s, wasn't it?
It was small.
So it was.
Did you have any help?
No, I didn't have any help at the time. No, it was small. I mean, I was a single practitioner. Barbara Vandenbroek was a single. Anybody who was with Arne, I think, might have had one or two people, but mostly anyone who was working in landscape. Bernie Ryan, but yeah.
He was in
Yes.
Livola.
Yes.
It may have been a bit bigger.
Not at that time, I don't think.
So they're primarily small practices, single practitioners working on multiple projects. Okay. So was there any particular architects or landscape architects whose work you particularly admired internationally, or?
I can tell you there was one sort of, it was like a bolt of lightning that came to Australia, and nationally he had influence, I think, just about everybody who was practicing at the time, and including architects, and that was Ian McHarg. He came to Australia and spoke at an architects conference in maybe 1970. Yeah, maybe 70, or even earlier. And he started to talk about, well, he'd written this book called, I suppose as you know, Design with Nature. And so he started to talk about natural things and the way people were wrecking the place, and it was all very controversial at the time, but I think it started people thinking differently to what they previously had been thinking. Because you'd have to think that after the war here, say 50s, 60s, were pretty bad in terms of architecture, because originally after the war materials were scarce, so there was limitations on what you could use, and then as it became further into the 60s, there was still probably all this sort of probably inward thinking, and this explosion of what the outside world was about happened, and this guy, I guess, was a bit of a catalyst for it happening
Okay,
in the
so sort of
70s.
opening it up to sort of
Mm.
more the international debates
Mm.
and or national debates that were
Mm.
happening at the time. Yeah. You go.
You also mentioned that you travelled abroad when you studied your botany
Yeah.
together with Blair,
Yeah.
I think. And were you already at that point interested in architecture and landscape architecture? And were there particular things you were looking at?
No.
Not yet.
No, because I worked as a teacher in England because it paid very well, and in Canada I worked in a nursery, so I got
Okay.
involved in
Well, that has relevance.
hands-on plants.
I had a question, but I just went out of my mind.
Sorry.
That's all right. Oh, sort of the shift to the native that you've been talking about.
Yeah.
When did that happen?
I think that probably happened maybe in the 70s,
Mm-hmm. And what?
60s and 70s.
60s, 70s, that's where I thought it
Yeah.
would be.
Yeah.
And what do you think was lying behind that?
Well, there was a group that formed called a Society for Growing Australian Plants, which promoted growing Australian plants, and then there were a few very one in particular, nursery person who actually collected native plants, and he had a nursery called Save the Trees, and they propagated native plants. So there were plants available at that stage, and then there was this desire that came through some of these influences like Arne Fink and the Society for Growing Australian Plants to use Australian plants in gardens,
Okay.
and I think that's
So it was primarily a supply issue.
when the supply was available,
Mm.
it didn't last. I mean, it was a brief encounter. Really.
And was that sort of a public resistance to?
No,
No?
because Australian plants in a suburban lot really don't work very well, and the native plants are very gregarious, and they really like to be bunched together, not planted singly in the grass or whatever. And they all died when it was wet. And so people started to go back to what they
More
knew.
traditional forms. Yeah. Did you ever work? Did you have any particular projects that took the native?
Yes, well, everybody sort of got interested in railway sleepers and rocks and native plants for a little while.
But then moved on.
Yeah.
I just sort of going back to history, I sort of think of the Griffins in Castle Crag in sort of the early 1920s doing a lot of this sort of thing, sort of situating the buildings within natural landscape, but also building gardens around sort of the native plants. Was any of that influential at the time? Was there sort of an awareness of that history from people like the Griffins?
Awareness of the history, but I don't know whether that was influential in anybody actually carrying that out. It may have been. Arne Fink may have been his inspiration. I'm not sure.
Sounds like a very interesting character, Arne Fink.
He was. How do I say? He might have been termed irascible.
Sorry.
Irascible. He might have been termed irascible.
Oh, okay.
He said what he thought, and I think he rubbed quite a few people up the wrong way.
Interesting. We'll have to dig up a bit more information about him, I think. Yeah. So, out of your projects that you've done over the years, sorry, I'm probably jumping the gun here a bit. Are there any you particularly attached to, or
any particularly attached to?
particularly?
Well, there are a couple, but not during that period.
That's okay.
There's a couple of big indoor gardens that we've done, and which is it's indoor within closed building situation, and there's a big atrium out at PowerLink which is was an industrial building that was converted to offices and centred around this great big garden in the middle of it, and so that was part of 1990 something, and it's still going strong, which is with an air-conditioned space. It had quite a lot of firsts in terms of establishing planting material and a landscape within an air-conditioned office, which led to a couple of other projects. We had also one at Shell down at the terminal in their main offices, which was another internal space, and following on for that, did some work in Melbourne on an internal space. And then there's another one out at UQ at Ipswich, the Biological Sciences building, which has also sort of lasted long. And then another one that was probably a bit of a pioneer in its day was Cathedral Square, where we built a landscape on top of structure, which hadn't really been done much in Brisbane before. So, and that's still going strong.
So you seem to be, these are quite interesting projects because it's definitely sort of bringing either the landscape into an internal space or an architectural project, or somehow more linking to sort of the top of a structure. So it's sort of that bringing together of architecture and landscape. These are the ones that are appealing more to.
Well, I mean, probably just lucky to get the commissions to do them, because they're not always available.
And you did the board work at UQ?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I walk that nearly every day.
Yeah.
On the car park. And they've just turned it into a sustainability walk. I don't know if you know about that.
No.
They've got new boards up saying, highlighting all the wildlife and plants.
Oh, really?
You might like to have a look at that little plaque in the footpath I've noticed, which is very new. Are you still practising?
Yeah.
Yes, you're still currently practising. And you haven't retired.
She only works 5 days a week now.
That's all. Oh, that's great. Did you have any more?
No, I don't think I have any more. Maybe I wasn't paying attention close enough at the beginning because I was filming with the camera. But did we go over what the curriculum was? You said it was stitched together from architecture, from botany, but do you remember precisely which courses you were taught when you studied landscape architecture?
Well, of course there was a design theme all the way through. So there was this design theme, but then there were all these outside subjects that architects normally wouldn't study, such as botany and geology and although the civil engineering and of course there was structures and that they were all totally involved with. So it was such a mixture that some people had really good knowledge of some things and the other group had really good knowledge of the other. So if you were lucky, you could get exemptions and save yourself a bit of time.
Do you remember what design projects were? What type of things you were doing when you studied landscape architecture?
No, not really. Not really.
Was it smaller residential or was it for civic projects?
I think it's ridiculous. I can't remember, but I can't remember any project we did in the design course that had any lasting issues. I mean,
lasting impression.
For my thesis, I did a practical experiment, just simply because I guess it was my background, of different types of ground covers, different types of mulches, and how they affected plant growth. And I did some
Friend lent us a vacant block of land.
Big plots, and analysed all the results. So that was probably my interest was more on this practical.
The scientific aspects of plant growth. Mm. Mm. Okay. Well, I think we might leave this interview.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that.
Yes, thank you.
Just